salam, and welcome to the channel What the Patriarchy, where we exist to dismantle the patriarchy one Muslim feminist issue at a time. Thank you for being here. This is Shahnaz Haqqani. Today we discuss Chapter 5 of Kecia Ali's book Sexual Ethics and Islam, of which we've covered the first 4 chapters and the introduction already. Chapter 5 of the book is on homosexuality, or same-sex relations in Islam. It's called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Same-Sex Intimacy in Muslim Thought, and it covers a brief history of the topic, the idea of don't ask, don't tell, basically don't out yourself and you're all good, which of course is very problematic. Same-sex marriage, and a coda in the 2016 edition in which the author talks about bisexuality, asexuality, some of the ways in which the language of the chapter as published in 2006 is outdated. And she provides some updates on how queer Muslims, LGBTQ Muslims, are talking about this topic since the publication of the first edition. Before we begin, if you're looking for a quick, simple, easy answer to the question, does Islam allow same-sex relations? The answer is it can, but it's very complicated. There are ways to read the Quran and the entire male historical tradition in a way that can allow for people of the same sex to marry Islamically, for marriage to not be exclusively for heterosexual couples, but that would require rethinking, reimagining marriage in a way that historical scholars who made the rules of what is and isn't acceptable in Islam didn't want to imagine. For more on marriage according to the historical Islamic legal tradition, you can see the previous videos in this channel in which I've summarized this particular topic on marriage. And for the author's specific suggestions, you can keep watching because I do get to this a little bit later. And of course, you can also read the book for more details. I have written a lot on this issue in my blog, and I'll give you some links in the video description. I assure you that it's completely, totally Islamically possible for LGBTQ people to get married Islamically and for them to identify as Muslim. So trust nobody who tells you otherwise. The chapter provides, I think, a good overview of the range of opinions on same-sex relations in Islam, in Muslim communities, specifically in the West. So you've got the usual, it's haram, people can't be gay, people can't get married to someone of the same sex. Those who insist that Islam can accommodate same-sex relations, and those who believe that same-sex desire is legitimate, but you can't act on it, and so on. And you should know that this range of opinions and attitudes is quite similar to what's available in religious Christian and Jewish communities today also. I have to say, for Muslims who insist that same-sex relations are haram, we have to ask here, what about same-sex relations is haram? What makes it so wrong? Which particular part makes it haram? Especially when, if you know anything about the historical Islamic tradition, or historical religions generally, the traditions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, etc., they totally allowed child marriages and said it was ethically acceptable for a man to enslave a woman in order to have sexual access to her. So those very unethical things are acceptable, halal, permissible, Islamically okay, but something like a consensual sexual relationship between people of the same sex is not? Why? Not according to the God that I believe in. People of the past who didn't even acknowledge their privileges, their biases, who gave themselves privileges that God didn't necessarily give them, are not my teachers. They're not my moral teachers. This is what we mean when we say that the whole framework of marriage as understood by past Muslim jurists is what needs to change. So here, justice for LGBTQ plus Muslims is inherently tied to justice for cis heterosexual women because the common denominator is patriarchy. But that's partly because, as the author highlights, in the past, humans didn't care so much about orientation, sexual orientation, but about actions. So the male scholars that we're turning to explain same-sex intimacy to us from Islamic, quote-unquote Islamic, perspectives are writing in a context and a world that is very different from our own, where same-sex activity today is connected to sexual identity. Also, past male scholars were concerned more with relationships between unequal partners, whether based on age, status, freedom, and so on. So their entire concept of marriage and sex was different than anything that we have today. And this is why when we talk about same-sex relations, and really just marriage and sexual relations generally, we have to acknowledge this context, this historical context. That context is just not our reality today. One important point, I guess clarification point, in the chapter is that for contemporary Muslims, the question isn't whether people do in reality engage in same-sex activity, same-sex sexual activity, or ever have, whether people are having sex with each other basically, but what Muslims are permitted to do Islamically, how to deal with something like same-sex desire from an quote-unquote Islamic perspective. And to answer this question, as with the rest of the topics covered in this book, we have to ask what we mean by Islam. If we mean the historical male textual legal tradition, the answer is it doesn't even consider the possibility that same-sex relations could be lawful, especially between two equal partners. But the good news is we don't have to take their word for it. If by Islam we mean the Quran and or Hadiths, it's a little bit more complicated, and besides, the Quranic verses on anything same-sex related are extremely vague. Many Muslims working on the topic of same-sex relations in Islam don't take hadiths very seriously on the subject, as these are hadiths of varying authenticity levels that tend to condemn same-sex relations. The Quran is what is relied mostly for reinterpretations of this topic, and of course the Quran deals only with male same-sex relations. If you're tempted to say that that's not true, because what about Quranic verse 4:15, verse 15 of chapter 4, the answer is that there's no consensus among Muslim scholars on whether 4:15 is about female homosexuality. The text there reads, "As for those of your women who are guilty of immoral conduct," the Arabic for which is fahisha, "call upon 4 amongst you to bear witness against them," and so on. And 4:16 is the same thing for men committing the same sin of fahisha, whatever that means. Who decided that this fahisha here necessarily and only refers to something sexual? Male same-sex desire is addressed in the mentions of the story of Lot. But of course, contemporary Muslims don't agree on the way that the story of Lot is to be interpreted. For example, is it really same-sex activity that the people of Lot are being destroyed for, or is their transgression something else? Some argue that it's spiritual corruption and other issues that they're being punished for, like rape. This argument makes excellent sense if you read it alongside the biblical account, because the biblical account gives us a lot more detail, like how the townsmen attempt to break down Lot's door and threaten to hurt him and his visitors. Since the Quranic account is not detailed at all, the biblical account gives us some context that I think is necessary. It's crucial for understanding what's happening here. In Genesis 19 in the Bible, for example, Lot begs the men of his town to please leave the guests alone, and they threaten to do to him what they were planning to do to the guests. And they break the door, but the angels save him from these evil men. I mean, you don't read that and go, yeah, this is same-sex desire that's being condemned, same-sex activity, homosexuality that's being condemned. Hopefully you read that and go, wow, that's rape, that's threats of rape, that's violence, that's criminal. Forcibly entering someone's home and threatening to commit violence against them, that's what's being condemned. What makes it rape? Well, the very violent nature of it and the lack of consent between Lot and these vicious men. Speaking of consent, though, Kecia Ali tells us that she's not totally convinced that it's about the lack of consent because, as we read in the Quran and the biblical account, Lot willingly offers his daughters to these depraved men of his town, the same men who are threatening to rape his guests and also him. So we, as contemporary readers of the Quran, are assuming that in this story, consent is necessary for lawful, acceptable, ethical sexual relations, but the text itself doesn't necessarily support this conclusion. But also, can we take a moment to condemn this? It's really not okay that a male prophet felt so comfortable doing something so unethical, so unacceptable, so haram, as offering his daughters to random, terrible, angry, violent men. This is totally unforgivable. Here in the story of Lot, we have the Quranic words that these men approach men in preference to those whom God created to be their mates. Kecia Ali suggests here that one way to interpret this is that these men would otherwise be choosing female mates but are opting to have sex with or prefer to have sex with men. In other words, they're going against their own individual nature, not necessarily against human nature. We'll come back to this idea of human nature and going against human nature in just a bit. But fun fact here, see, a lot of Muslims think that the reality of homosexuality and the acceptance of homosexuality are a Western, quote-unquote Western, invention, which, by the way, is a huge lie, because if anything, homophobia is a Western invention. And these Muslims condemn the idea of imitating other people's cultures and ideas and practices, but, and here's a fun fact, the Muslim male scholars of the historical Islamic tradition, whose opinions and ideas we take a tad too seriously on anything, but especially on same-sex relations and on gender generally, actually borrowed most of their ideas on homosexuality from classical Greek and Roman peoples, like the language they used in the discussion of homosexuality itself. There's this hierarchy of the penetrator versus the penetrated, the dominant and the passive partner, the acceptance of a preference for male youth versus female partners. But of course, Quranic verses were used to justify such pedophilic ideas, like when the Quran speaks of ghilman and wildan, which literally translates to something like 2 boys or 2 male servants or 2 male children, which is supposed to be some kind of a reward that we get when we go to heaven. The author notes that even some conservative Muslim scholars today have come to accept the idea that homosexual desire is innate in some humans, but they still don't necessarily support the idea of same-sex marriage. But such Muslims have to deal with the questions of divine justice because on the one hand, they recognize God has created humans who naturally incline towards humans of their sex, but on the other, they're not allowed to do anything about that desire. This is especially important given that traditional Islam recognizes the importance of sexual satisfaction as a basic human need. I think a lot about the privilege of heterosexual Muslims making decisions about what is and is not legitimate for queer, non-binary, non-heterosexual people. So, for example, on the one hand, being all marriage is necessary and sex is an important thing that Islam recognizes, and even attacking other religions for not having a healthy relationship with sex. But then on the other hand, requiring gay and lesbian and other non-heterosexual LGBTQ people to be celibate permanently. And this idea that it's a test from God, having to be celibate for life is a test from God. Yeah, like LGBTQ people's entire existence and the way that society treats them generally isn't test enough. The whole discussion on homosexuality anywhere in the world reeks of heterosexual privilege. Kecia Ali puts it very powerfully, and here I'm going to quote her directly from page 111 of the new edition. If one accepts the view that homoerotic desire is neither freely chosen nor inherently blameworthy but can have no licit satisfaction, then one is left with the untenable stance that those who desire a satisfaction that cannot be obtained through licit means are, through no fault of their own, destined to choose between a celibate life devoid of sexual gratification and one of sexual release obtained through sin. In other words, the only 2 options given to them by heterosexual lawmakers are inherently unfair. The good news, though, is that, as Ali suggests, it might actually be possible to view the fulfillment of same-sex desire through licit, Islamically acceptable means. But doing this would require some tricky exegetical maneuvering of certain Quranic verses that speak of male-to-female relations. And this possibility can still be reconciled with the Quranic idea that same-sex acts can, not are inherently, but they can become reprehensible or forbidden when and only if and when such acts are freely chosen by those who would ordinarily choose sexual satisfaction with different sex partners. Basically, the argument here is that as long as one is not transgressing against their own nature, their own natural inclinations, same-sex relations can be acceptable Islamically. The best part of this argument to me is that every human's nature is not necessarily the same universally, so other people can't know what's against a person's nature or not. Only God would know, and it's only God that you would have to be accountable to, not humans. Another reason I love this interpretation is that in this argument, what becomes a sin is forcing a gay or lesbian person to marry and have sex with somebody of a different sex because that is against their nature from what they tell us. This argument would require trusting people when they tell us that they know themselves. As I keep saying, Ali points out that Islamically permitting same-sex marriage would require a whole revamping of the legal structure of marriage as understood by Muslim jurists in the past. But if you think about it, we're already doing that anyway. Most of us don't think of marriage as a form of ownership or slavery or kingdom where the husband controls the marriage in exchange for a mahar. Historically, the same scholars who came up with this system did actually consider alternative possibilities like, can the woman be the one to give the mahar to the husband and retain control over divorce and sex like the man can, as they concluded. But they conveniently, apparently unanimously, agreed that, nah, that was ridiculous. That's not okay. Again, as in the previous chapters, a big question mark here to me is this Islam? Is this the Islam that we want to practice? Because, see, very specific, very limited views of sex and gender were essential to this framing of marriage. A woman cannot control the marriage tie and have unilateral access to divorce based solely, exclusively on the fact that she's a woman, on her gender. Similarly, a man gets access to these things, is afforded privileges and responsibilities based solely and exclusively on his gender. For the scholars, reallocating or redistributing these roles and duties and responsibilities would create a chaos, so it's best not to interfere with them. But once we complicate their ideas of gender and sex, everything falls apart. Once we complicate and challenge their approach to marriage, this framing of marriage, nothing really makes sense anymore. Although, in my opinion, given that these are clearly human ideas and articulations of the human body and human actions and so on, we don't necessarily have to rethink or reimagine the whole structure of marriage. You see, the jurists historically always made exceptions to the rules that they were creating. Like, for example, the marriage of intersex people. So we have options as ethical humans. We can simply say, okay, these rules don't apply in this particular context, to these particular individuals, to these particular groups of people. But of course, that raises a whole bunch of questions, and that's precisely my point. What they said in the past doesn't necessarily work for us today. Because it's true that the fiqh idea of marriage is so premised on hierarchies that we'll have to totally reconfigure the system of marriage in order to accommodate something like same-sex marriage. We'll basically have to rethink marriage as what the Quran understands marriage to be, which is as a source of tranquility and love and mercy for the people involved in it. And apparently that's too much to ask for. I need to stop now. We'll come back to this topic another time. But, I love my fun facts. So in this chapter, in sexual ethics, we have a discussion on something called kaba'ir, which is a technical Arabic term that amounts to something like major sins. According to whom, you ask? Well, according to cis male heterosexual humans of different time periods. But the important thing here is that they actually didn't quite agree on what counts as a major sin. But just because it's fun, here's some things on one dude's list in his list of kaba'irs, okay? Illicit sex between a man and a woman, which is called zina. Anal intercourse between two men, called liwat. Intercourse with animals. Tribadism, which is apparently defined as, and I quote, a woman doing with a woman something resembling what a man would do with her. What? That's not vague at all. Oh, and one of my favorites, having anal intercourse with a female stranger. I have a lot of questions. Oh, and some of them add having anal sex with a wife, but that's not an agreed upon sin because God didn't make it haram. All right, I'll stop here. Thanks so much for watching, and keep fighting the good fight, because injustice to one community is an injustice to us all. Salam.